So today we're talking about better semantic vectors, or retrofitting word vectors to semantic lexicons. So we're all familiar with how machine learning models require a human readable word to be encoded into a vector of numbers. We also know that we have to be smart about how these words are embedded onto the vector space, such that their values tell us something about the word, something more than just this word is word number 1 and this word is word number 2. Now, there are an abundance of methods that do this: word2vec, glove, all the famous ones. But the question posed here is, why don't we inject some lexicon data into these word vectors for improved semantic relations? The paper we look at today is titled Retrofitting Word Vectors to Semantic Lexicons and was authored by Manaal, Faruqui and 5 others from the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and was presented at the proceedings of the North American Association for Computational Linguistics in 2015 and has a little over 600 citations at this point in time. But before we move on, we might stop to ask ourselves, or the authors of the paper for that matter, why we're even bothering with something like adding semantic information to our word vectors after the fact. Because we can all recall from most of the embedding schemes already aiming to accomplish almost the exact same thing, rendering all of this a little bit redundant. Well, the main drive for retrofitting is the realization that the conventional methods of capturing semantics are intrinsically tied to the machinations of the method itself, meaning that they're usually inflexible by nature and that any new lexical information we would wish to incorporate would involve retraining and rebuilding the vectors from scratch or modifying the methods themselves. By contrast, if we elect to employ a post-processing step to incorporate this information, such as with retrofitting, we can first of all use any vector model as the basis, and coming across some new or better lexical semantic information becomes a simple and relatively faster matter of applying all of it again. Also then, how are we going to formulate the problem of post-processing semantics? The words are used to construct a relational graph, such as the small portion of the one shown here, with different words as its nodes and the edges being some semantic relationship between the words we're interested in. And these edges are different for different semantic lexicons, as we're going to see. Then we have the blue nodes of the graph representing the vectors we've already learned for the word embedding from glove or word2vec or whatever we have. And our goal is to learn the gray nodes such that their values are, number one, numerically close with their original counterpart, and also adjacent nodes in the graph we constructed with the semantic edges. We can describe this more formally. Assuming that vector similarity is defined by Euclidean distance, we can write that the goal of the training is to minimize the distance between the observed value and the inferred value scaled to some value alpha, plus the distance to all of its neighbors, q of j, scaled to some value beta. And this isn't all too computationally expensive. It isn't backpropagation on deep neural networks or anything like that, and is said to converge in about 10 iterations of the method presented here. Now we'll take a look at some of the word embedding algorithms used as the baseline for the retrofitting. First, we have global vectors, or GLOVE, which we've talked about previously. And of course, that scheme uses word-to-word co-occurrence statistics to build up a semantic map of the entire vocabulary. Here we're using a pre-trained vector trained on the English Wikipedia dataset with about 6 billion words, and the dimensionality of the resulting vector is 300. Next after that, we have skip-gram vectors, or more commonly known as the word-to-vec embedding. And this model uses Huffman coding of words into a log linear classifier, which predicts words within a context window. Pre-trained on the Google News dataset with about 100 billion words, these vectors also have 300 dimensions. global context vectors are learned by a neural network which incorporates local and global contextual informations and is trained on 1 billion words from the English Wikipedia website with a resulting dimension of 50. And finally, we have the multilingual vectors, which work by performing singular value decomposition on text of multiple languages, and then canonical correction analysis to match words that are parallel in the different language corpora. These vectors were trained on the WMT 2011 dataset with 360 million words, and the output of that is 512 dimensions. The choice of which lexicon to sprinkle up on top of our freshly baked word vectors is also a choice we can make among a variety of options. And in the present experiment, we chose 3. The paraphrase database, which contains 220 million pairs, where a word or phrase is matched with its paraphrase, and in constructing the graph, we use each lexical paraphrase as an edge between the words, and make sure that the edges between the observed and inferred vectors have higher weights. WordNet is a word relation lexicon made by humans, and it groups words into synsets, or sets of similar words. The graph for this lexicon is made so that the edges are synonymous relations between two words. And lastly, we have FrameNet, which is not dissimilar to the WordNet, but contains richer information about lexical semantics and predicate argument pairs by grouping the words into so-called frames. Words within the same frame here are given an edge in our implementation of the graph. A series of benchmarks are formulated to test the effectiveness of this retrofitting. First, we want to test the word similarity through a set of human-made statistically derived similarity benchmarks, namely the WS353 dataset with 353 word pairs and their similarity ratings made by humans, RG65 with 65 nouns, and the MEN dataset with 3,000 pairs sampled from a web corpus, and its evaluation metric is cosine similarity between the vectors. Syntactic relationships are tested with a dataset containing word pairs that share a syntactic relationship, such as verbs with different tense form, and the performance is calculated by posing questions of the form A is to B, C is to D, trying to guess D and seeing how close the vectors are to that of D when we take A minus B plus C. Questions from the TOEFL of the form asking the examinee to pick the most synonymous word from a set of given words is used to test synonym selection. Again, the answer should be one with the smallest distance between the vectors. And finally, sentiment analysis is tested on comments or phrases that are annotated with their supposed sentiment, and a logistic regression classifier is trained on the average of the word vectors in the input to predict the sentiment label. And here are the results. While we see general increases in performance across the board and see that the paraphrase dataset gives us the strongest improvements for most of the tasks, we can see that for something like syntactic relationship task, the model has utterly failed, decreasing the score by considerable margins here. But for tasks such as TOEFL questions and word similarity tasks, there are marked improvements, perhaps due to the problem being almost directly dependent on how well we place closer words, closer together. So we definitely see some improvement in the quality of word vectors when they are retrofitted with semantic information. We're not just randomly permuting numbers here, but we also have to raise the question of whether this information is relevant to the task at hand, for example, and by extension to wager what information is actually lost in the process of this retrofitting. So we're changing numbers, and it's not a stretch of the imagination to reckon that something's going to be sacrificed when we are doing so. And lastly, how are these better semantics going to be utilized by our larger and more complex language processing models, like with text classification, machine translation, and more? Either way, that's been it for this talk. Thanks for listening.